to this when we brought you Thomas Edison. And some of you might remember hearing about that. I'm with the Enid Chautauqua Council. If you've heard of the word Chautauqua, it has to do with bringing history, bringing education to life. And we have several programs going on in Enid. This has been 2 weeks of Enid Chautauqua in the schools. So you are going to meet Clara Barton. And I hope you've heard of Clara Barton. We're going to go back in time to meet her. Clara Barton is perhaps one of the most famous women in American history. As a teacher, a battlefield nurse, lecturer, organizer, and president of the American Red Cross, Barton served her nation and her community tirelessly, dedicating her life to voluntary service. The year we're going back to is 1891. Miss Barton has just built her home and headquarters for the newly formed American Red Cross near a Chautauqua community. In fact, she is a regular lecturer on the Chautauqua circuit. You will hear her tell her story of nursing on the battlefield and beginning the Red Cross. Then you will have a chance to ask Clara Barton some questions. Please welcome to our stage, Miss Clara Barton.
Let's see, good morning. Is my microphone working? Might need a little more volume. Oh, well, maybe that's too much. Good morning. I often travel about talking to people about my experiences during the American Civil War. When I would go to the battlefield, I would see thousands of soldiers lying there in pain, in agony. I had never seen so much blood, so much gore in my life. And I would ask myself, how can I address all of these problems? But I simply stopped asking the question and I plunged in to do my best. For I have always believed that one person can change the world. Indeed, even as a young woman, I was given insurmountable tasks. When I was 18 years old, my parents wanted me to enter a life of service, but they weren't sure what job to give me, so they had a friend of theirs, a man who was a phrenologist. You probably don't know that name, but they're doctors who feel the bumps on your head and tell you what your profession should be. So, Dr. Fowler came to our house and told me I should be a teacher. A teacher, I said. I had grown up on a farm. I was very shy. I could not imagine being in front of a classroom of students. But my parents took his advice and found me a job as a teacher at a one-room school. Furthermore, I was told there were 4 big bullies in this school, and they had run off the last few teachers. I was terrified that day. But I went to school, and I began the day. I started by reading from the Bible, and then I went out at noontime, and I played baseball with those boys. I showed them that I could throw the ball harder, and I could run faster. And I never had any trouble out of them. In fact, they became my best students, carrying my books home for me every day. Soon the word went around that I had the best disciplined school in the district. I protested. I had not disciplined the children. I had simply respected them and given them a reason to respect me. But because of my good reputation, I was moved from problem school to problem school. And I taught for the next 12 years. But I always regretted not having advanced education of my own. There were very few colleges in those days that would accept women, but there were a few. And so I went to the Clinton Liberal Institute that was affiliated with the church I attended. It was in upstate New York. But I only had enough money for 1 year. Still, I was going to make the most of my year of college, and I made good friends. I did make the most of it. I had friends, and I attended classes. At the end of 1 year, I had completed 3 years of school. But, as I said, I I was out of money. Now, I had made a very dear friend named Mary Norton, who remained my friend for the rest of my life. And I went to stay with her family in New Jersey for a while. And I thought I might get a job teaching there. But then I found out that the students in New Jersey, unlike Massachusetts, where I had been born, every student in New Jersey had to pay for school. And those who didn't pay ran wild on the streets. I thought every child deserved the advantage of an education. And so I went to the school board, and I volunteered to teach those street children for a year. I was laughed at. I was told they don't want to have schooling, but I was given a dilapidated building, which my friends helped me to rehabilitate. And then I opened the doors to my school. The first day, I had 6 children attend. The second day, I had 20. By the end of the month, I had 600 students. And I had to invite my friends to help me volunteer to teach them. And I had proven that everyone wants the opportunity of an education. And I was given permission to supervise the building of a new building for them. But then I found out I was not going to be permitted to be the principal of that school. For only men were principals, even though I had been acting as the principal for free for a year. I would get half the money as assistant principal the man did. Well, I might work for free for a while, but I will not work for a man's work for less than a man's pay. So I quit. And I went to Washington, D.C., where my sister lived. I still needed to work, though. I was not married. I didn't have a husband to support me. I did have a friend, a congressman who was a cousin, and he got me a job in the patent office. You know, a patent is when someone has an idea, and they petition the government to protect that idea so they can manufacture or make that item and nobody else can steal it from them. My job was to copy the patents at 10 cents for every 100 words. And because I was a quick worker, I made as much money as the men made in my office, which made them very angry. They did not want a woman making as much as a man made. And they said nasty things to me. They spit tobacco juice at my skirts. Soon I had to work out of my home. It was so intolerable to work with that harassment. But that would change. For when James Buchanan was elected President of the United States, all of us who opposed slavery lost our jobs. Oh, I ardently opposed slavery. I've always been what is known as an abolitionist. I believe in getting rid of slavery immediately. And because of my political beliefs, I lost my job and returned home to Massachusetts. But 4 years later, there was another election. And Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, and all of us who opposed slavery were recalled to our jobs. But the city to which I returned was a very different place. This was a city that knew war was inevitable. Everyone talked about it at street corners and in gatherings. We all talked about the war that was to come. So when Fort Sumter was fired upon, no one was surprised. However, I was surprised at how unprepared the army was for all the soldiers that came to the city. From all the northern states, soldiers poured into Washington. And the army had not prepared one place for them to sleep or any food for them to eat. Not one cot, not one tent. Was that any way to treat a young man who was willing to fight and die for his country? I was most worried about the boys in the 6th Massachusetts Infantry, for surely they would be boys who had been my former students when I was a teacher. I found them all right. They were sleeping on the floor of the Senate chamber because there was not a single place to sleep in the city. Furthermore, they'd already been in a battle. An angry, pro-Confederate mob had set upon them in Baltimore, and not wishing to fire upon civilians, they fled and left their supplies behind. When I found them, they had not eaten for 3 days. I was so angry these young men were treated this way. I went home, I emptied my kitchen cupboards, I persuaded a grocer to open up even though it was Sunday, and I hired 5 men to carry the food up Capitol Hill, and I was met with great cheers of joy. Now I knew what I wanted to do, how I could help these soldiers and help my country. Since I couldn't go to battle, I could help the soldiers. I began to write to everyone I knew, I sent letters to newspapers, I wrote to people all over, and I asked for supplies to be sent to me. Soon my little apartment was overflowing with supplies, and I had to rent a warehouse to hold everything. And then we heard the news. There was to be a great battle at a place called Bull Run. There had been small skirmishes already in the war, but this was a major battle. For you see, Bull Run is the junction of the railroads, and whoever could control 2 railway lines could control the area. That's why that was almost destined to be the first major battle. And those soldiers marched out, so proud, so patriotic. But they did not do well. They had not been well trained. They were raw, green recruits, and those Southern soldiers were more determined, better prepared. And the entire Union Army turned and ran. It is called a rout. Can you imagine 100,000 men running back to Washington? That was terrible news to us. But worse news than that. Thousands upon thousands were left on the battlefield, for the generals had decreed they did not want an ambulance system. Simple wounds that might be easily patched up. The men died from exposure and starvation instead. I wanted to go to the battlefield to help those soldiers. But it simply was not done. Women were not permitted on the battlefield. Only men were nurses. People thought women would faint at the sight of blood or run when they heard cannon fire. I knew that I wouldn't. That's where the need was. There were city hospitals where women nursed, led by a woman named Miss Dorothea Dix. Perhaps you've heard of her. She's done a great deal of work with the mentally incapacitated. But she was difficult to work for. Her nurses called her Dragon Dix behind her back. And she decreed that only ugly, unmarried women could work for her. Now, I wasn't married, but I didn't think I was ugly. And I didn't want to work for someone so controlling. I wanted to help the men on the battlefield, not at the city hospitals. And so I continued to knock on office doors, trying to find someone who would give me a pass to go to the battlefield. Finally, I met Colonel Daniel Rucker. He was the quartermaster, and I told him I had supplies. He asked what I had. I said blankets and food and lanterns. He asked me how much I had. I said by now I had filled 3 warehouses full. He was so surprised, he gave me a pass, not to the battlefield. You see, in those days, what they would do, they would have a battle, and then they would bring the men on these terrible ox carts that were very uncomfortable and only exacerbated their wounds. And they would bring them to train stations to bring them into the city. So I was allowed to go to where the train station was. That was called the evacuation area. Well, I gathered some friends, and we organized some wagons, and we waited for news. There was a great battle at Cedar Mountain. Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general, had done terrible work against our own Union boys. And the evacuation site was the Culpeper Courthouse. So off we set. I shall never forget what I saw when we arrived. Thousands of men had been brought from the battlefield and simply dumped in the broiling sun. There was not one attendant there, giving water or simple bandaging or making the men comfortable. Inside the courthouse, there was a temporary hospital. The few doctors were so overworked, they had no time to clean up after themselves, and the floor was covered with blood and slime and who knows what. Immediately, I got to work on my hands and knees cleaning the floor. One officer stopped me and said, "Madam, is this not an unseemly job for a lady to do?" I said, "Sir, is this not an unseemly place for these pain-racked men?" But mostly I just gave food and water. For the next 4 days, we worked at Culpeper with very little rest, with very little food of our own. And as I wearily made my way back to my home in Washington, I knew my job now. To stand beside the soldier between the bullet and the city hospital. Of course, I went home and was exhausted. My health was never very good. I had suffered malaria when I was younger, and I never had very strong health ever since. But I was able to do these long bouts of working, and then I would collapse from exhaustion. But when I awoke, I studied my jagged nerves and got back to work replenishing supplies. And then we heard the news. There was to be another battle in the very same place that first major battle, Bull Run, again because of the importance of the railroads. A second battle, a year into the war, and this time, 8,000 men were forgotten on the battlefield. A year into the war, and we still had no ambulance system. Well, this time the evacuation site was the Fairfax train station. So my friends and I loaded our belongings onto a train car, and off we set. The site was much the same. It rained, and the men had been brought, some laying on pallets of hay, others on the cold, wet ground. We got to work, making food, giving water, doing simple bandaging. One time, I was bandaging the wounds of one of the soldiers, and he said, "Miss Barton, Miss Barton, don't you remember me? It's me, Charlie Hamilton." Charlie Hamilton. One of those bullies from that very first school where I worked. Poor Charlie. He had carried my books for me, but he would never carry books again, for both his arms were mangled beyond use. It's no wonder we wept while we worked. And still we worked on. At one point we had worked for 36 hours, and one of my volunteers collapsed from exhaustion. And I realized I had better get some well-deserved sleep. There was a lull in bringing the men from the battlefield, and I went to a tent that had been assigned to us, only to find the rain had poured about a foot of water into that tent. It had gathered because of the rain. I was too tired to care. I laid down in the water, propped my head up on a crate, and slept for an hour. But when I heard the ox carts returning with more men, I got up and wrung the water out of my skirts and went back to work. And then I realized at one point, the men were being brought from the battlefield to the train station, and they had not eaten, and they would be taken to Washington, which would be another day's travel. The battle had been 4 days earlier. These men had not eaten for 4 days. So I worked it out with one of the officers. I made huge pots of porridge and gruel and cornmeal. And every wagon was brought to me, and I clambered up on the wheels, and I fed each and every one of the soldiers by hand. 7 times in one wagon train, I saw boys who'd been my former students. It's no wonder our hearts were heavy. No wonder we wept and worked. And then the news came. Stonewall Jackson was going to attack with his soldiers. And if they attacked while we were there, all of us would have been taken prisoners of war. But this was before medical personnel were considered non-combatants. Well, we quickly had to get every soldier onto the train, and I made sure every soldier was on the train before I was. In fact, the train began to pull out of the station, and a friend of mine had to grab my hand and pull me aboard the train. But I made sure every soldier was safe. Well, I went back home. With the exception of that 1 hour in that soggy tent, I had been awake for 90 hours. So, of course, I slept and collapsed from exhaustion. And then I woke again and got back to work. A telegram was sent to me saying I could finally go to a battlefield itself, that I had proven my value. I was able to go. There was going to be a great battle near Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And I could take 4 wagon drivers, they would give me from the Army, and four drivers and wagons. I could only take a male assistant with me because my one friend had collapsed. I said she had worked 36 hours before collapsing, but at any rate, Cornelius and I set off. Those wagon drivers were just like those 4 bullies. I had to win them over with respect and laughter, but I soon did. But we had another problem. We were at the end of a long line of wagons, about 40 miles in length. At the beginning was the cannons and the guns and such as that, and the end was our supply wagons. I knew that once the battle began, it would take us 2 days to get there. I had to get to the front of the line, but you simply couldn't pass. As you were traveling down the road was so clogged with soldiers marching and wagons, you couldn't pass other wagons. But we would camp at the side of the road each night. And as I lay in my tent one night, I thought to myself, what would my military father do? And I had the answer. I woke my group up in the middle of the night, we packed up, and we got to the front of the line. And the very next day, the battle began. Now, I had never been to a battlefield itself, so I wasn't sure where I should report. I saw cannons explode over a cornfield with a great deal of fighting, and then the fighting moved off to the west, and I went back to that cornfield. The sight of that cornfield, haunts my dreams to this day. I have never seen so much blood, so much gore, so much misery, so much suffering. Men recently wounded begging for help, calling for mercy, begging for water. I would go from soldier to soldier, trying to help as best I could. Soon my skirt was so soggy with blood, I'd have to wring it out before I could take a walk. And then I noticed a path leading from the cornfield. Surely that would go to a house that would have been made into a hospital by one of the doctors. So I followed the path. And when I got there, I found Dr. James Dunn. I had met him already in Culpeper and Fairfax. And when I saw him, he said, "God has remembered us indeed." For all of his supplies were at the end of that long line of wagon trains that where mine had been. I looked. He was bandaging the wounds of the soldiers with green husks of corn from the cornfield. As I unpacked my bandages, I thought never before has linen looked so white. I established a hospital in the barn and found 12 soldiers who were not badly injured to bring me those from the cornfield, and immediately set to work. I did simple nursing at this point, removing some bullets that were only superficial wounds, giving food and water. One time I was giving a young man some water, and under my arm came a bullet, killing the man as I held him. I will never patch the hole in that dress, preferring instead to remember the brave self-sacrifice of our soldiers. It was also at this battle that I took my first place at the operating table. For at one point, the shells began to explode overhead, and all of the male nurses went and hid in the cellar. But I knew Dr. Dunn would not stop working, so I went to the operating table, and I held the arms and legs while he cut them off. I think it's ironic that people thought a woman would run when it was the men who ran and I stayed strong. But for the most part, I simply made food. At one point, the line that stretched from our hospital was 2 miles long of men looking for food. And then I realized I had run out of food. How could that be? I had thought and planned so carefully that I was completely out. The only thing I had left were 6 crates of wine. And while that was not enough to feed a battle-starved man, I opened those crates up at any rate and had one of the greatest joys of my life. You see, in those days, we would pack wine bottles with sawdust to keep them from clinking together and breaking. The women who had packed those boxes had used instead cornmeal. Enough cornmeal for me to make 8 hearty kettles of stew. In fact, there were 17 hospitals at the Battle of Antietam that day, and the one that I served was the only one not to run out of supplies. Well, we didn't need to stay very long, for finally, a year and a half into the war, an ambulance system had been established, and I was able to go back to my little home after just a couple of days. Again, I was exhausted and went to sleep. But when I awoke, I found that Dr. Dunn had been interviewed by the newspaper. But instead of talking of his own experiences, he talked about me and called me the angel of the battlefield. And soon that article was reprinted in newspapers across America, and I became very famous. And women all over America reported to Washington to be a battlefield nurse just like Clara Barton. And I became the superintendent of the nurses of the Army of the James. But something else happened because I was so famous. Women all over began to write to me personally, asking me if I had seen their son or their husband. Now, I know what it's like when your loved one is missing. My own brother was a prisoner of war in South Carolina, and I worried about him until I found him and brought him home to me. So I tried to help these women as best I could. But after the war was over, I had an idea, and I went to President Lincoln and himself, and I asked that I be put in charge of an office of missing soldiers. He thought it was a good idea. He wrote a letter that was published in every newspaper in America asking that all inquiries be directed to me. Sadly, it was one of his last acts of office, for just a few days later he was assassinated. And we grieved so greatly for this wonderful man who had done so much for our country. But I couldn't stop to grieve. I had to get to work. I went to Annapolis, Maryland, where I set up an office, and I received thousands and thousands of letters. Not all from families, but some from soldiers, telling me where they had buried a beloved comrade and how they had marked his grave. All in all, we were able to find 22,000 graves of missing soldiers. But after 2 years, I had a great deal of trouble. I was doing this work for free, and I was funding the office with my own money, and I was out of money. What was I to do? The office now could be run by a clerk, but I had to get a job, and a friend of mine suggested that I go out on a lecture tour, such as I am doing here today. And I thought that was a good way to make an income, and in fact it was. Over the next 2 years, I gave 300 lectures. But again, my health could not withstand the grueling stress of that much travel and that much presentations, and I completely collapsed. My voice was gone, and my doctor said that I needed a convalescent leave, a sick leave, I suppose you would say. Well, I had made enough money. My sister and I went to Switzerland for a vacation to see some friends of ours who were there. And while I was in Switzerland, I received a visit from some gentlemen. My fame had spread to Europe. People knew of my work, but I did not know of theirs. They had created an organization called the International Red Cross. A young man, Henry Genet, had witnessed a terrible battle at Solferino, Italy, and he created an organization of many different countries bringing supplies and help during times of war. And they created what was known as the Treaty of Geneva. 39 countries had signed that they would help each other in times of war. In fact, the only civilized country that had not joined was America. I was afraid they would think we were barbarians. And then I got to see the work of the International Red Cross. But the Franco-Prussian War began, and I found myself once again in war work. Everywhere that little red flag went, there was order and cleanliness and a lack of suffering. What we failed to do in 4 years, they accomplished in 4 months. I was most impressed, and I worked tirelessly for the next 2 years with the International Red Cross. My job was in Strasbourg, France. I was helping with the refugees, and I organized some women to sew clothes for all of the displaced people. And it became one of the most important beliefs of the American Red Cross, which I would found later, that we helped people help themselves. We didn't give charity. We helped people find their strength in themselves. But again, after 2 years, I collapsed from exhaustion. And I realized I needed a convalescent leave from my convalescent leave. So I came home to America. But my little suitcase was packed with information about the International Red Cross, and I was determined to get America to sign the treaty. I worked for 9 years. American politicians were not interested. And I realized why. Because the International Red Cross was formed to help each other in times of war. America wanted no part of a foreign war. But I also knew there were disasters throughout the world where people needed help. Tornadoes and hurricanes and floods and epidemics. And so I began to organize small groups, calling ourselves the American Red Cross. The people who helped me the most were the veterans of the Civil War, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And they helped form small chapters. And when the politicians saw the good work we did at the forest fires in Michigan, and the floods in Ohio, and the yellow fever epidemic in Florida, they began to realize the importance of our work. And in 1881, Chester Arthur signed the legislation to create the American Red Cross. And he sent me to the convention in Switzerland that year. I was the first woman diplomat to represent America at an international convention. And at that convention, the International Red Cross changed their constitution to say from now on, the International Red Cross would help all people in times of war and disaster. And that is named the American Amendment in my honor. I came home to America, I'm ready to work. I was 60 years old, and I was ready. Most people would go think about going home and sitting in a rocking chair, but I was beginning a new job. I was going to make the American Red Cross the most premier disaster relief agency in America. My friends, I cannot promise you there will never be another disaster in this nation. or in Oklahoma. But I promise you this, wherever there is heartache, wherever there is suffering, the American Red Cross will be there to help. No question is a bad question. Okay.
Anybody have a question?
My friends, you were a remarkably attentive audience. Excuse me. Can you focus over here? You were a remarkably attentive audience. The questions are as much a part of the presentation as a monologue. And if I can't hear the question, I can't answer it. So I need to ask you to continue to focus your energies here and stop talking amongst yourselves. Thank you. Okay. Okay, hold on. She's asking a question.
What was the worst battle wound you have seen or had seen?
The worst battlefield? Oh, my dear, every battlefield is awful.
The wound. The
worst battlefield wound. Well, my goodness, when they would chop off an arm or a leg, I suppose. During the American Civil War, we actually perfected the amputation. Before that, they didn't know how to amputate. And what they figured out a way how to do it well so the person would live. And as a result, the field of prosthetics has grown greatly because all of these soldiers went home sometimes without a limb. But seeing an arm or leg cut off, but then seeing that arm or leg get infected was also really horrible to see.
What's your question? Miss Barton, how old are you today?
Oh, well, I'll answer. As Clara Barton, I am 70 years old today. That's Miss Barton.
Miss Barton, yes. There's a question in the middle.
There's one over there, the way back.
They were worried about your death, but I said, well, she looks good today. So
you can answer that. Again, no question is a bad question, but I'm very much alive right now. But I will answer that in a few minutes.
Okay.
I promise you. Don't let me forget. There's one in the back, a light blue sweater, let's see, or sweatshirt or something.
How many years were you a teacher?
How many years was I a teacher? Well, 12 years initially, and then the 1 year in New Jersey.
Shh, gotta stay quiet.
And when I went to the Sea Islands, that was where Fort Wagner battle was, where the famous Massachusetts 54th Infantry of black soldiers fought. And I served those black soldiers as well as any white soldier. For they bled the same and had died the same for their country. But also in the Sea Islands, there were so many children, so many recently freed slaves. None of them could read or write. And so Francis Gage and I created some schools on that island as well.
Right over here, we had a gentleman ask, were you ever wounded in battle?
It's a very good question. But miraculously, I was not wounded in battle. I mean, there were bullets flying, as evidenced by the one coming under my arm. I think by the grace of God, I was never wounded in battle. That's a good question. You'd think you would be.
Miss Barton, did you ever marry?
I did not ever marry, not that I wasn't asked. I had several gentlemen who were interested in marrying me. But you must understand, in my day, if I had married, I simply could have not carried out my work. I would have had to go home and take care of the house. And by the time I realized what I wanted to do with my life, I realized marriage was not a part of that, and so I chose not to get married. But it wasn't because I wasn't asked.
Over here, a gentleman asked, how many people what's the largest number of people you think you treated in one time?
It would be completely impossible to make that guess. You were too busy helping each and every one. You didn't bother to count. You didn't know. It's hard to say. There are so many huge battles.
Somebody have a question over here?
There was one here.
Right here. Yeah, I got you. Right here.
How long did it take
Oh, how long does it take you to teach someone to read and write?
Oh my goodness, that's a good one. But there's two more in the back while I'm answering this question. How long does it take? Well, each person's different. You know, each person has a different level of ability, and people learn differently too. You'd find some people could see a letter and learn it, but others people had to listen. I think a teacher might be able to answer that question here because it's been so long since I've taught.
Okay, he's wondering, can you give us a good description of like the work conditions, the scenery, what you would see around you?
The war conditions?
The work where you were, well, yeah, the war, yeah.
Well, again, there would be a battle, and there would be, and just laying everywhere were men, just in extreme agony and pain. Some would have larger wounds than others. Some wouldn't be able to move at all. Let me add, and then it would be taken. We would set up tents for hospitals, and we would get these big plastic tarps to be under them, so the ground wouldn't be wet, and then we could clean those easier. But it was just in a hillside or a field or a farm that suddenly would be transformed into a nightmare of misery and suffering, I suppose.
Good question back here. Do you feel like you ever suffered from PTSD, which is what we call it? Did you
Actually,
have trauma?
PTSD was a word that was used in my time. And yes, I did suffer from PTSD. PTSD was something we even discussed back then. And so I know the post-traumatic stress disorder. And yes, I would say many times, many times, I would have flashbacks. If I hear a loud noise, I'm suddenly back in the battlefield. So certainly it was very traumatic as well.
How many honorary medals did you receive?
How many honorary medals? Too many to count, and I think I might get more before I die. So I don't want to give you a number, because I'm only 70 right now. I'll bet you I get more. This gentleman here in the front, Miss Liddell. Where all did I travel when I was in Europe? I first went to England, because I wanted to meet a woman named Miss Florence Nightingale. People often say I'm the American Florence Nightingale, but I want to know why they don't call her the British Clara Barton. We met for a day, and then I went immediately to my friends in Switzerland. And then while I was in Switzerland, I have a very good friend named, she's the Duchess Louise Baden-Baden, and she's the Grand Duchess. And so I went to her country in Austria, and I went to France. I went all over France and Germany and all over Central Europe.
We had a question over here about, did you ever use dogs to try to search for people? Did you ever do that?
No, that was not something we understood to do at that time.
Okay, and then we wondered, how did you amputate?
All right, you want the details? What would happen? She wants to know how they'd be amputated. So what they figured out to do is they would saw through the flesh, right? They would pull the flesh back and then cut the bone, and then they could pull that flesh forward and tie it off. And they would use hot tar to seal that wound. All right, so that's, before that they would cut something off and you'd have this bloody stump that would not heal. But when they realized they could pull back the skin and the tendons and the muscle and cut the bone and then pull that forward, there would be a way to save that limb. You wanted the details.
Could you tell us your response to some of did you cry? I mean, how
did I
you
cry?
saw these things?
Absolutely. I would sob and work and sob and do what I could do. I tried to keep my spirits up for the boys, of course. I tried to help them be as positive as possible, but sometimes you couldn't help but cry. I see hands there and I see hands over here.
Yeah, and we've got a question here. How big was the school?
How big was the school? It wasn't very big at all. We had to find another building for those 600 kids. Is that what I think you meant, right? That little tiny school in Bordentown?
How did you sanitize things on the battlefield?
Well,
or did they?
We didn't know about sanitizing. We didn't know about germs at the time of the war. A doctor would cut an arm off and then not clean the knife and cut another one off. It wasn't until August of 1865, the war ended in April of 65, and in August, a Scottish doctor named Dr. Lister created the first antiseptic surgery. I think later there's a product that's named after him, if you think about that, Dr. Lister. But he was a Scottish surgeon, and he was the first to understand germ theory. And then we began to understand that better. But we did not understand about germs at all. We couldn't see them, we didn't know them.
Okay, right here I want to know what kinds of weapons were used, and did you ever have to kill anyone?
Oh my goodness, I never had to kill anyone, and I wouldn't have. I served Union and Confederate, black and white, anyone who fell, I would serve that person. I would never have killed anyone. And even I have never had someone attack me that I would need to have self-defense. I was seen as the angel of the battlefield, not an enemy at all. Buttons. Well, buttons are made of metal or sometimes wood.
Okay, I want to thank you for all of these questions, Clara Barton.
Yeah, I want to say one thing.
Yes, please go ahead.
Go ahead and do the next part, and I'll say that later.
At this time, Clara Barton's going to vanish, sort of, and I want to introduce you to our speaker, Karen Verange. And she's with us today. Karen Verange is a scholar, she's a storyteller, she's an actress, she's a writer with a Master's of Arts in Humanities. She's a retired instructor from Concord University. She weaves together her love of history, a passion for stories, and her performances. She's known for living history presentations of famous American women, and she's appeared in Enid Chautauqua many times in the past. In fact, she'll be with us this summer doing Jackie Cochran when we have a theme of aviation. At this point, I want to introduce Karen Verange, and if you have a question for her as a scholar who can tell you other things about Clara Barton after 1891, this is your chance to ask those questions.
And let me answer the question that was asked, when did she die? Clara Barton was 90 years old when she died. She was born on Christmas Day in 1821, and she died on Good Friday in 1912. To put it in context, she died 2 days before the Titanic went down, just so you know. Now, Claire, she was 90. She died of pneumonia, but she had complications of old age. She had had a couple strokes, and she was not well. And eventually it was pneumonia that killed her, but she had a good, long life. She was the president of the American Red Cross until she was 85 years old. And then she retired. She couldn't stand, though, not working, so she created the National First Aid Society, so at the age of 85. And then by the time she was 88 or so, she was fairly infirm, fairly bedfast at that point. So now, are there questions for me about my work, or maybe something about Clara in later years, or anything? Yeah, not anything. No, I'm not going to answer anything. There's a question right there. A young man, I can see in a white sweatshirt.
How do you go about researching the characters that you're doing?
What a good question. It takes about at least a year to study one character, at least a year. And partly that year, I think, it's because we all have other lives, husbands and kids and housework and jobs and, getting your tires changed in your car, and things that in everyday life, So if I could spend every day doing nothing but that, maybe less. But it takes me a year. It takes a year, I think, for it also to sort of seep in. Now, every character is different because of what's available. Clara Barton only wrote one autobiography, and that was a story of her childhood. But because she's so important, there are some really good scholarly books about her. So I read biographies about her, and also her diaries are available, and that's how we know the word PSTD was used as early as that time, so she knew she had that. Her diaries, her letters are available, so you try to read as much primary as you can. Many of the things I said in my presentation are direct quotes. Some of the words I said. So I try to put as many direct quotes in as I can. So it takes at least a year, but then you never stop. did Clara Barton, and I don't know the year when I came here and did it. Was it 2012? But I haven't done her much since. I had to begin researching again in October before I came here. Rereading some things, looking at all my notes. One thing that I try to do is create a timeline of her life so I can look at that and go, okay, these are the years, boom, 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 boom. And it helps me remember what her life was. So when I have 14 characters that I do. So it's really hard to keep up with them all at one time.
Okay. Here's another question, kind of along this line. As an actress, how do you get into that character?
As an actress, you know, I tell you what, putting this jacket on makes me stand straight. It gives me that posture. I feel, you know, I'll be walking around my hotel room before the jacket's the last to go on, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm Clara. So I also, you know, she spoke very formally. I don't know what her voice sounded like, but when I talk, you know, you can tell the difference the way I'm talking now and the way I spoke as her. So each of my characters, I think, if I can find a voice for them, it really helps me immerse myself in her world. And then the costume makes such a difference. It really helps me to understand.
He had a good question. What are some of the other characters that you have done?
Some of the other characters, oh my goodness, I don't have enough fingers now to count them all off. Mother Jones was a labor organizer. She organized coal miners. Pearl Buck wrote during the 1950s. Edith Wharton was active in Paris in World War I. Gertrude Bell was an archaeologist and expert on Arabia and the Arab culture. Grace O'Malley is a 16th century Irish pirate. I can actually use that ship that's been built there for my character. Let me think what else. Julia Child is a cook. Who else? Cass Elliot is a 1960s rock and roll star. Belle Starr was a Wild West outlaw that lived in Oklahoma. I created her for Oklahoma Chautauqua. Emma Edmonds was a Civil War soldier and spy. She was a woman who decides to disguise herself as a man and worked and fought for the Union Army. So that helped me with Clara Barton because I had all the Civil War stuff already. Luella Parsons was a gossip columnist. I don't know if I missed somebody or not. Oh, Laura Ingalls Wilder and Mary Draper Hicks.
There was one other question in the back that I wanted to get in. He wanted to know how school was different for you than it probably is today for these young people.
That's a wonderful question. Well, first of all, Clara's parents were very strict, and they sent her to school at age 3. And she was miserable. She was very shy. And so they didn't make her do more than a year. She went back when she was 8 or 9. But for the most part, the early schools were one room, and there might be 30 or 40. Probably that first class she had probably only had 20. But there might be as many as 40 or 50 kids in one room. The teacher would teach all grades. So she'd get the first graders started doing something, and the 5th graders doing something, and the 6th graders doing something. But for the most part, in Clara's day, most students only went to the 8th grade. I'll tell you what, these kids covered up in 8th grade what you were covered until 12th grade. It's amazing when you look at it. High schools and middle schools don't really start until the late 1800s, when we have suddenly this industrial revolution, we have a middle class, and we have people with spendable income. What do we do with our kids now? They aren't going. Most kids went to work when they were 13. Really and truly. You guys should all be already working in the steel mill or a textile mill or somewhere, you know. Only a very few wealthy kids went to what was called a finishing school. But high schools really begin in the late 1880s. And then, and so they begin to expand the education. But up until then, most students only, my grandfather only went to the 8th grade. You know, I mean, that's good, and he went to work on the farm. That's what they did. That's a good question. I've never had that question before. I love it.
One last question here.
Okay, so the Red Cross thing, later on in like our time, it also has Blue Shield on it. When did that get added? When was that added?
Well, that's a good question. Not in Clara Barton's time, so I don't know the exact year.
Sorry.
But no, it's okay. The Red Cross, of course, was the reverse of the Swiss Cross in honor of the man who founded it. The Blue Shield Society was a war competitive society. There was a White Cross, Blue Shield, Blue Cross, and Red Cross. And they were all trying to do the same work the Red Cross was doing. And the Blue Shield Society was out of Boston. And they got really, really active. So I think it wasn't until about the 30s. They continued working, even though the Red Cross was the premier one. The Blue Shield actually today is a health insurance agency. So it might be, when you see that, you might be seeing this health insurance agency that's helping the Red Cross. But the Blue Shield originally was a competitive organization. And I'm thinking what you're saying is that insurance agency. Excellent question. Excellent. And I was going to say, if you have more questions, go back to your classroom. For those of you, wherever the cameras are, I don't know where they are, those of you who are watching, write the, I see them right there. Write down your question and look it up on the internet. Almost anything about Clara Barton can be found on the internet, trust me. You might even find about me. I don't know for sure. So there's no question that's not a good question. And so I encourage you to do that. These are great questions.
Hold. Have a seat for a second. Young man, have a seat and chill.
Okay. I want to thank you again, Karen, Brunch, and I really want to thank Enid High School for allowing us to come today. Thank you, Mr. Liddell. It's been a pleasure, and if your parents want to see her on Saturday night,
Awesome. Some love from our performance of Clara and McDonald. Very good job as an audience. You're on to the 4th hour. Please leave the place spotless. Appreciate you guys. Have a great Wednesday. Go Big Blue.